What did you like about Pap?
Well, I liked him. He used to play the fiddle.
Mm.
He was really nice to me. He was nicer to me than anybody else I ever went with.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that was probably one of the things that attracted me the most, was how attracted he was to me, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
How good he was to me.
We actually call her grandmother Ying, which is the Chinese word for grandmother on the father's side of the family.
I called him Grandpa Foot.
We, in our native language, in Hindi, we call them Dada and Dadi.
My other grandmother would be Maman Bozorg, which is Persian for grandmother.
Muchechu means old woman in Kinyarwanda.
I called her Safta, which is a Hebrew word for grandma.
Everybody called her Mamitita.
We called her Mima and Dede.
Grandma.
Hi, I'm Steph.
And I'm Robin. Welcome to Stories from Grandparents,
the podcast where we share stories about and from grandparents.
On today's episode, you'll be hearing about love stories from grandparents.
So I actually have my own love story to share with you today, and you're going to have to pretend like you've never heard it before.
Okay.
So my mother's parents, they lived and met in Edmundston, New Brunswick, and they met working at a hardware store. And so they started dating. And at some point, the way that I've heard the story is that my grandfather was in the hospital. And I can't remember if it was like getting his appendix removed or he had gone into an accident or broken a leg. I can't remember, but he was in the hospital. And so my grandmother went to visit him. And so she took the bus and she got on the bus and she ran into a friend of hers. We'll call her Doris because I don't remember what her name is.
It's a good old lady name.
Exactly. Yeah. It goes with the time. So she runs into Doris and, they sit together and, catch up or whatever. And eventually my grandmother was like, "Oh, where are you heading?" And Doris says, "I'm going to the hospital." And she said, "Oh, yeah, right. Like, I'm going to the hospital." And then my grandmother was like, "Who are you going to see?" And Doris said, "Oh, I'm going to visit my boyfriend." And my grandmother was like, "Oh, me too." And then I think it was by the time they got to the hospital, they realized they were going to see the same person. They were both dating my grandfather and visiting him at the same time. I don't know how he did not consider this as a possibility, but they essentially confronted him while he was laid up in the hospital bed and made him choose. And luckily for me and my existence, he chose my grandmother.
Yeah, lucky for me too. Otherwise, where would this podcast be? That's a good story though. That's really cute. I like that.
That is nice. And they ended up having a pretty nice and tough at times marriage, but overall they had a lot of love for each other.
Nice. Our first guest is my grandmother, who we call Nan, who talks about how she met my grandfather, who we call Pap. Why don't you tell me about how you and Pap met?
Pat met? Well, after I worked at the Air Force Base in Chatham, I didn't like it there at all anyway. And my girlfriend, Stella, she was down in Moncton. And I went to Moncton to get a job. And I got a job at the bank. And lo and behold, there I met Pat. Yeah.
He was working there too?
Yeah. He actually hired me.
Oh.
So he was into motorcycles, loved motorcycles. So he asked me to go out. He was going to do some racing this day. So away we go. Dad and Mom never liked me going on the motorcycle, but we did. We went out and he had his motorcycle and he would race it.
Mm-hmm.
That was his big thing. And then they'd spend all this time fixing them. And he was with his buddies there. We met in May, and we got married in December. June, July, August, September, October, 7 months.
Oh, 7 months, yeah.
Yeah. So he had gotten a transfer, so, you know, he wanted me to go down, and in those days you didn't stay together, you know.
Mm-hmm.
It's quite acceptable now, but, I mean, at that time it wasn't. So we got married in Bay de Vin.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So we went. It's hard to look back and think that it's been this long. So that was in 1959.
You got married?
Married in 1959, December. I guess I didn't make too many mistakes there, did I?
Nope. Still together. Going strong.
Our next story is from Jill and Trevor, friends of mine from New Brunswick that we interviewed together, and they told us a story about how their grandparents got married.
My grandfather used to go down early in the morning and start the fire in the schoolhouse, the one-room schoolhouse. But I believe he quit school around grade 6, grade 7, because he told, from what he told me, he just had no interest in it anymore, and he decided he'd rather have money than continue going to school. But when my grandmother and my grandfather were married in 45, Joe? Yeah, 45. My grandfather was in the Army. He tried to get in twice before he was accepted, but he had, the first time he had, I believe, pleurisy, and they rejected him, which in those days, there's many stories of, the young men, even going as far as committing suicide, not even being able to join the Army. Mm-hmm. But my grandfather was rejected again for a stomach issue. But the third time he got in, and he was at the camp in Nova Scotia, Debert. He trained there. I remember him telling me, well, even to this day he still talks about it, of doing drills down around Fredericton, around the exhibition grounds and places like that. But he was stationed in Debert, and I remember him telling me he went AWOL to marry my grandmother. So he jumped the train, came to came to Fredericton, got married to my grandmother, and he was here. Their honeymoon was, I think, like a Sunday night. So they spent like 2 or 3 days together total, and then obviously he had to go back or go to jail. So he went back, and I remember him telling me that his commanding officer, his CO, when he got there, questioned him about why he had left, and he's like, "Oh, I went home and got married." He's like, "Oh, congratulations! Don't do it again."
Oh, wow. Do you know how old they would have been when they got married?
My grandfather would have been 23. Uh-huh. My grandmother, Jill, how old?
17.
17.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, so they're quite young. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so...
And little did anybody know, or I guess they probably knew, but one of the reasons he probably went AWOL was because she was already pregnant, as many of the old gals were back in the day. Mm-hmm. So she was already pregnant, and she used to joke that the first baby can come anytime, and after that it takes 9 months.
To add to Jill's story about my uncle, their firstborn, we didn't know that it was always kind of kept hush-hush. They didn't say anything. Like, my grandparents didn't show affection in public. It was more, behind closed doors. But we had their 50th anniversary when we were younger. It was at Victoria Hall in New Maryland. And I remember we were standing kind of all around, and they had said, "Oh, what date were you married?" And they told the date. And we all kind of looked at my uncle, and we're just kind of like, "So you were..." We kind of all figured out that my grandmother was pregnant, like a shotgun wedding type thing. Mm-hmm. My grandmother was pregnant while they got married. And I remember her just looking over at everybody, "Shut up." So it was kind of a cute story.
Yeah, that is cute. And now you're going to hear from Natalie, who tells the story of her grandparents, but she talks about a different kind of commitment, a commitment that can last even when a marriage doesn't.
So I was closest with my dad's dad. Yeah. When I was really young, my dad had gone away to university, and my mother and I lived with my dad's parents till I was about, 4 or 5. So I became pretty close with them. You know how they always say, like, you will either fall in love with someone who reminds you of your parent or someone who's really opposite than your parent. So my dad was gone for the first couple of years. He was in university. So I fell in love with someone who was exactly like my grandfather. So my grandfather was the kind of person that would wear like cords in July And my husband, Danny, definitely wears cords in July. My grandpa was also very calm and like a quiet thinker, didn't feel the need to argue. He liked experimenting with things. So he would do things like, invent a new potato gun that could, blow a roof off someone's farmhouse. He loved nature shows, and that's something I definitely took with me. If you ask my husband what like a romantic night in is, it's laying in bed watching David Attenborough. Like I would do that
me too,
every night. Yeah.
That's awesome.
Yeah. What else about my grandpa? I think I have a very maybe innocent view of him. He did suffer from bipolar disorder. And from what I gather from my grandmother, who eventually had to leave the marriage, he could be rough at times, but I never saw that. He was always really, really kind with the grandkids. I don't think back then diagnoses like that were common.
Or maybe even accurate.
Or that, yeah. So, I don't think it came out that Grandpa had bipolar till probably I was a teenager.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. And I think my grandma had tried to make the marriage work for probably, 10 to 15 years before she decided to leave. And she's been gone for about 10 years from the marriage. He grew up in a different time. He grew up in a time where you wouldn't take medication unless your leg was festering or broken. So I don't think he understood mental illness, didn't understand that it's okay to take meds. It's okay. It's a legit thing. It doesn't mean, that you're
still
weak.
That
that you're
stigma
weak.
Today,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
So for someone in that generation.
Yeah. So he would do the thing where he would take his meds until he felt better, and then he would go on a high. He tended to be more manic than depressive. But when he was on a high, then he would stop the meds, and then the cycle would, continue. He, the stories now that I look back on and I think are so funny. Like the time where he decided he didn't trust electricity anymore, and I had come home from university, and I was just visiting with them, and he said, So what do you think about this hydro business? And I thought there was some kind of like scandal, like some Ontario government scandal or something. And I'm like, what do you mean? What did you hear? And he's like, electricity. What is it all about? And I'm like lights? Like, what do you mean? And it was around that time or sometime after that he decided he wanted to get rid of the furnace in the house. So when I look back, I think about these charming idiosyncrasies that my grandpa was so crazy, but actually my grandpa was so crazy.
Yeah, and it was like it's like kind of funny for from an arm's length, but
now
to
that
be
I understand,
dealing with it in a marriage where it's like we need a furnace.
Yeah, now that I understand it was a mental illness, not so funny, but it's just how you remember things as a kid.
Totally.
Yeah. Well, I was very, very, very close with I am very, very close with my grandmother as well. She, like I said, she's still alive. She's still kicking. She is with another man now. So they dated when they were young, like 15. And my great-grandpa Flegel found out that he was Catholic. So they put an end to the relationship really quickly. And then they didn't see each other for 50 years. And my grandma went to I don't know if she actually went to the high school reunion or there was just a Facebook page or something. Somehow, his name was Don. Somehow Don found out that my grandma was going to be there or something. And I guess sent her a note. And I think my grandma because my grandma's a very Christian woman. So I think she has a lot of guilt around, leaving the marriage, especially when my grandpa was mentally ill. But at the end of the day, she decided that life is short and she was gonna choose happiness. And I'm very happy for her that she did that. So she's been with Don. I think they just wrote letters back and forth for a while and decided to meet up. And then she decided to leave the marriage. And then for a number of years after she left the marriage, she would still take care of my grandpa. She'd still go over once a week and do some cooking or drop off food or do the laundry. Or I remember even finding out that, Dawn would go with her and Dawn would do firewood and things like that. So they still, she still took her wifely duties very seriously. Which again is different time.
Yes.
Can you imagine that someone doing that now?
Yeah.
God.
And that she's had that allegiance to him or that loyalty.
Yeah, because he's the father of her children.
Yes.
So, and I don't know if that's still something that's common in today's culture, maybe. Yeah. I don't know. If my husband divorced me, I'd starve to death. I don't care if you eat. And I think she took my grandpa's death the hardest. Like I said, I think she had a lot of guilt, and I think she wasn't sure how to grieve because I think she felt like she wasn't entitled to grieve as a wife.
Yes, that's an interesting. That's actually a really sad position to be in.
And then she felt like if she emoted too much, then it was disloyal to Don, and then she felt guilty because she wanted to comfort her children, but felt like, is part of the reason he's dead because I wasn't there to take care of him. You know what I mean? Yeah. So it was really, I think that was probably the hardest thing to watch was watching her be unsure about how she was allowed to feel and being really kind of uncomfortable. When we were at his he didn't have a funeral. He had a celebration of life thing. And she was just a little scattered. And at one point, she was talking to my mother, and my husband walked up to the two of them, and she said, "Maureen, this is Natalie's husband, Danny." And my mom's like, "Yeah, are you okay?" And she's like, "Oh, geez, I'm not even." So she was very kind of distracted, and so that was sad for me because I would hope that she would just be comfortable, and you can love two people. Like you can love people differently.
Next, you'll hear my friend Dustin, who tells us his grandparents' love story.
My grandpa traveled around a little bit after the war, and then he returned to Sydney to work in the bank. It was the Bank of Australasia. Wonder if it's still a bank. I don't know. But and there he met my gran, and her name was Faye. Well, her name was Margaret Faye, but we always called her Faye. And so he met her, and I think at some point he had been to Vancouver early in the war. Like he came to Canada for training. I think he took a boat to Los Angeles and up to Vancouver, and then like a train maybe to Alberta. Anyway, so he came to Vancouver. I remember them telling me like, oh, Grandpa came to Vancouver, and it was a nice, beautiful day, and he thought it would be a nice place to live. And he said, if it was raining, maybe I wouldn't have decided to come here because it rains so much, right? But yeah, so anyways, I guess, and also when he returned to Sydney, because of, his skin grafting or whatever, I think that the doctor had warned that the hot weather and the sun in Australia is going to be maybe challenging for him just because they won't have sweat glands or something. Like it doesn't function like normal skin. So I think he liked the idea of living in Canada because he thought it would be like milder climate and wouldn't be so harsh. And he wasn't like a sun worshiper, really. He was more like he liked fishing and being outside and stuff like that. So I think it appealed to him. Anyway, so he decides going to move to Vancouver. And I think at that time he had been engaged to my gran or proposed to her. And so she was going to come to Vancouver to be with him. But neither of them didn't know anybody in Vancouver. So it was kind of a big deal, like just to leave Australia where you've lived your whole life. Well, especially for my gran, because she hadn't lived anywhere else and didn't know anybody. But so he came to Vancouver, and he began a career with the CIBC, Canadian Imperial Bank of Commerce. And my gran came over on a plane. I imagine it would have been her first time probably on a plane. So I wonder what that would have been like back in those, like in the 40s, right? Flying from Sydney to Vancouver. That just seems crazy.
Yeah.
Actually. Not that the people weren't already flying in planes, but it would have just been different. Like,
and such a shock for her.
Well, think about the planes we ride on now compared to what the plane would have been like in 1948.
Full of cigarette smoke. For sure, full of cigarette smoke.
Maybe the drinking and the smoking helped. The drinking and smoking helped you with the loud noises and probably, So anyway, so she came over, but I thought this was really interesting. They weren't married, and my grandma was very, very Catholic all her life. And my grandpa converted to Catholicism to marry her. I think he was Presbyterian or something. Because my grand's family originally from Ireland, and I think my grandfather's family was originally from Scotland. So I think the Scots were Protestant, and the Irish are obviously Catholic. So I know it was an issue at the beginning, And then eventually he converted for her. But anyway, so she came over and she had to stay with a chaperone first because they were not married, right? They didn't want them to stay.
So they didn't live together?
They did, like, after they got married. But, like, when she first arrived in Vancouver, they were engaged, not married. So she didn't stay with him. She stayed with, like, a chaperone. So I don't know if it was a family friend or
who was the chaperone? Oh, yeah. So it was like someone she knew. Know. Yeah, but that's so interesting. So your grandma has to be escorted everywhere, so she doesn't, like, you know.
Yeah, like, not like that. I think the word chaperone meaning, like, just someone to stay with.
Oh, okay.
You know, like, they were just, you know, like, it wasn't like she had to go everywhere with, like, an old lady following her, making sure she's not sinning. I don't think it was that extreme. I think that was just the word they used.
Okay.
So I don't know. Anyways, but they did get married. And they got married, like, was very, like, they didn't have their whole families out here. I'm not sure. I feel like I've seen a picture of my gran and her sister as, like, a bridesmaid at her wedding. So I don't know if my grand's sister came here for that or not. But anyways, my understanding was they got married here, like a small wedding, because they didn't really know a lot of people here. And then they went and they had their honeymoon at the Empress Hotel in Victoria.
Ooh, lovely.
So, yeah. So I just, like, it just seems interesting, you know, like, imagining them, like, young, like, moved to a new city, not knowing anybody, like, completely different time, like, and then all, like, really good, beautiful memories. And, like, and him and my gran, they had a really nice long life. And they died within a few months of each other. When my gran died, she passed away actually on her birthday, her 91st birthday.
Oh, wow.
I know, it was interesting. And then a few months later, he passed away too. They were so in love, like, their whole life, you know, and especially now, like, that's just so rare.
Mm-hmm.
You know, like, they would like walking around, like, holding hands even in their 90s, you know.
Yeah, it's so lovely.
It was still, their bonds were so strong for all those years. It's crazy.
Do you have any advice for a long marriage or healthy marriage?
Well, probably commitment would be a big thing.
Mm-hmm.
I think that getting married is still a good thing. I think it's still a good thing, especially if you have that commitment, because if you're just don't intend to get married, maybe you think, well, maybe it makes it easier to leave.
Yeah.
If you're not married and you just have a big fight or something, and maybe you just say, well, this is it, you know, I'm not putting up with it. Mm-hmm. But I think if you're married, you get over it. There's one thing passes and something else happens. There's just, everybody has their little tips, that's for sure.
Mm-hmm.
Life is not always smooth,
mm-hmm.
but I think you have to have a lot of give and take.
Mm-hmm.
And I can't say that I'm one that should be telling you, because I know that nowadays that the kids, mother and father, both work,
mm-hmm.
as I did. But I was growing up in a house where the mom did everything.
Mm-hmm.
So dad provided and mom did the work, you know.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't think I've ever seen him pick up a dish or anything, you know.
Mm-hmm.
So nowadays, I think if you get into a marriage and you're doing that, helping each other, continue it.
Yeah.
Continue with it.
Yeah, that's good advice.
And make it a little bit fun once in a while.
Yeah.
Even if it's just like we do, going for a coffee over at Tim Hortons, or take our gift cards from the Subway and go and buy the sub, you know. Meeting with friends and just make every day count. Have a few outside activities.
Yeah.
Volunteer if you can. I'd love to see you go to church.
Mm-hmm. I know you would.
For your own sake, if not for mine.
Yeah, I know.
It just gives you a little bit of security. It's a personal feeling, so whatever works for you.
Yes, I agree.
Thank you for listening to Stories from Grandparents. If you have any interest in submitting stories or if you want to participate on the podcast, please send us an email at storiesfromgrandparentspodcast@gmail.com.